Our off-road camper trailer suspension cops a real hammering from water, mud, sand and corrugations. After our recent outback trip, I noticed that our tyres were suffering some abnormal wear. I found 4mm more wear on the inside edge than the outer on both tyres. So, looks like it's time for a wheel alignment. The process I'm going to go through today is actually covered in the Cruisemaster Masterclass series, which you can find on their website. I'll put a link in the description of this video. In the case of the Patriot Camper, we can't actually adjust camber. Camber is set into the suspension when it's manufactured. The only way to adjust it is to physically replace some bushes, which we shouldn't have to do on a camper that's only a year old. However, the toe-in is adjustable, and we do that at the inner suspension point by either moving the back of the wheel out for toe-in or the back of the wheel inward for toe-out. When doing the wheel alignment on our trailer, we want to make sure that we've set it at the correct height. In the case of Cruisemaster's X-Cruise suspension, they recommend a shock absorber length of 395mm from centre to centre of the mounting bolts. That's how I normally run my trailer when it's fully loaded or when I'm out on the track. And I've actually marked the shock absorbers with some reference lines to help me find that position. I find that's much easier than trying to use the guide plates on the inside of the wheel arch, because it only takes a slight amount of parallax error and it's hard to really tell where you're at. So I always go by those marks I made on the shock absorbers, and we'll set the trailer to those heights now. Once we get the trailer at the correct ride height, we can go ahead and check the alignment of the wheels. Even though the camber isn't adjustable, we'll check it just to make sure that nothing is bent or worn or out of alignment. And then we'll check the toe in and toe out, which is one of the things that we can adjust. So to check our camber, we just need a small spirit level that picks up two places on the face of the wheel that are at the same relative distance. In this case, we can see that the top of the wheel is slightly in, or we have negative camber. And that's exactly the way that Cruisemaster design it. To check our wheel alignment, we need two straight edges. I use a 1 metre straight edge, and we put that across the face of the tyre, picking up 2 points that are at the same relative distance from the wheel centre. And we put it roughly at the same height as the chassis rail, because the chassis rail is our reference that we're going to measure against. I then use a 600mm or 2 foot long steel rule. We then measure from the chassis rail out to a straight edge. And I've got 420mm at the front. And 420mm at the rear. So that this wheel is tracking exactly parallel to the chassis, which is pretty good. We'll measure it and go to 1mm of toe in. And we do that by moving the adjustable pivot point on the suspension, which actually kicks the back of the wheel outward. We'll go and check the other side now. Okay, so our camber looks good, exactly the same as we had on the other side. Small amount of negative camber. And at the front we've got 419mm. Wow, and 408. So we've actually got 11mm of toe out, which really explains why we're getting that uneven tyre wear. This tyre is out of adjustment, or this wheel. So this wheel is pointing outwards. Now, even though it's only one wheel that's out of adjustment, it can affect the wear on both, because at times this wheel will be the dominant wheel getting the most traction, and it will steer the trailer across, which will then put the other wheel out of alignment as well. It'll also explain why on the return of our recent trip, I thought the trailer was wandering a little bit on the road. As each tyre takes grip, it's going to steer the trailer slightly differently, leading to that waggy tail that you can sometimes get. Well, this side definitely needs adjustment. While we're at it, we'll make that small change to the left-hand side as well. Now, the trailer's already at the correct ride height. When we make our adjustments, I will raise the trailer off the ground, particularly on this side, because when we make the adjustment, it'll actually load up the tyre as we move the suspension, and I want to relieve that stress or that tension to make sure that we've really got the measurement that we think we have. And we'll also roll the trailer in and out of the garage a couple of times just to make sure that everything is settled in, and we'll take a final measurement to make sure that our adjustments have actually held true. So as we mentioned, Patriot Campers with the Cruisemaster X-Cruise suspension don't have adjustable camber. We can only adjust the toe in. In the case of my left-hand wheel assembly, I had neutral toe in when we actually want a little bit of positive toe in. So this lever and cam assembly moves the inboard pivot point either forward or backward. In our case, to generate some toe in, we want to move the suspension arm outward at the rear to make the wheel point into the centre line of the trailer. So to do that, we're going to move the pivot point backwards, which means moving the cam forwards to lever it in the direction that we want. And because I'm on my own today, I'm going to have to climb in and out to do this, to check the measurements. Always easier if you've got two people. One person can be monitoring while the other person makes the adjustment. So I'm pretty happy with that. And as a final step, we'll torque the suspension point and bolts. Now that we've torqued the nut, we'll double check our measurements to make sure nothing has moved. So with our alignment sorted, I thought we'd do a little bit more maintenance and lubricate the suspension pivot points. I usually do these after every big trip, and on really long trips, I take the grease gun and we do them every second or third day, depending on how far we've travelled, particularly if it's dirt roads, lots of water and corrugations. So you can see when we're pumping the grease in, what we're looking for is to push the new grease, to push the old grease out around both of these bushes. It can make a bit of a mess when it's pushing the old grease out, so it's worth having a couple of rags around, and maybe even leave those rags underneath your grease points for a day or two, because it can continue to force its way out of the joint and make a mess on your garage floor. That grease looks fine. It's a different colour only because I'm using a different brand than the grease was in there previously, and the outboard pivot point is pushing its grease out up high, probably why you can't see it. Now you can't really over-grease these things. All you'll do is push more of the old grease out and more of your new grease in. So don't be afraid to go to town. It's the sort of thing you're better off over-greasing rather than under-greasing. You can see some of that old grease is quite black from the outboard hinge point, suggesting that it's working a bit harder or it's had some more contamination in it than the inboard point.
Well, that's got our suspension in good shape for our planned trip out to Western Queensland. We'll be doing a couple of 1,000 kilometres, so I'll keep an eye on things as we go. If you find any abnormal tyre wear, or you feel your trailer isn't tracking as well as it should, it's literally a 5-minute job to grab your straight edges, check that wheel alignment, and know if you've got a problem. Whether you fix it yourself or you send it to an expert such as Cruisemaster or Patriot.